be presenting our methodology on ethnography. Ethnography has a very old origin. It's actually been around well before the 1800s, but in the 1800s, anthropologists began to look and study different races and cultures to get a difference of what was a contrast from their European experiences. So simply stated, really, ethnography consists of making observations and recordings and transcribing social interactions and really becoming immersed within a cultural experience. So it's rooted in anthropology. However, you could also say, even prior to the idea of anthropology, many people have immersed themselves in a culture and gained experiences from that. So the primary purpose of ethnographic research is to work within the field and to really collect data over an extended period of time. And the practice can be divided into two distinct categories, that of social change, of cultural change, and historical change. And then definitely a focus on what could be philosophical values. So change is what is being looked at in a different viewpoint based on the topic. So what does the methodology help a researcher to actually explore? Well, it depends how the researcher approaches their task. And there are two different ways that they can do that. And from this visual, you can see you can have a participant observation, so you can be fully immersed in the process, or you can be a non-participant and you can be looking at the process and surveying and asking questions in a more reflective way. So participant observation is engrossed in anthropology, sociology, communication studies, human geography, social philosophy, and its aim is to gain a close and very intimate familiarity with a group of individuals. And so you have that difference between that methodology. Some of the characteristics of ethnography are the use of both formal and informal conversations or interviews, and that includes probing questions. Yet it can be done in a casual way to incite really candid accounts by the individual being interviewed. And so you can see this cycle of how that actually works. And we would start with that general research question first, and selecting sites and collecting data, recording the data, analyzing the data, and then actually writing. As we consider the 7 characteristics of an ethnographic research project, first and foremost, carried out in a natural setting, not in a laboratory setting. It's an extended period of contact within a field site, so you have to be committed to that. An objective to acquire an overview of the content within which the study is situated. It's both systematic and it's holistic. Documenting emerging themes and a native perspective. Employing methods orientated toward the descriptive and interpretive research. It's inductive and constructs local theories that can be tested in both the current setting and elsewhere. Investigation is always guided by a research question and not a hypothesis. And finally, the focus of analysis is on words, text, and images rather than focusing on numbers as a quantitative project would be. So terminology unique to this, there's not necessarily all that much unique terminology. An ethnographer is the person who spends the time living with and interviewing and observing a group of people and is their task to describe the culture. Field notes, that is what the notes are largely consist of that they're taking during that interaction time. The Likert scale is one that's commonly used. It's a 5 or 7 point scale that surveyors take and give out to those that are part of that. The non-participant observer, that's that individual who observes and records data about a group without participating in their lives, compared to a participant observer who engages in the lives of the people being studied and actually records data about them.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to be presenting our next set of slides, beginning with some major authors associated with ethnography. The first two authors that you see had major works in the 1920s, and the last one at the end was in the early 70s. Margaret Mead, in the first picture, was a well-known anthropologist and women's rights activist. She had many publications in the 1920s and the 1970s, and her most well-known one was called Coming of Age in Samoa, which gave a vivid and descriptive view of the lives of adolescent boys and girls in Samoa. And you can see her picture there with the children in Samoa that she studied in the Manus Islands. In the middle, we have Bronislaw Malinowski, who was known as the father of ethnography. For 2 years, Mr. Malinowski moved to the Trobriand Islands, immersed himself in their culture, and learned all about their marriages, families, myths, magic of their culture, and more. He was most famous for his publication that resulted from his fieldwork titled Argonauts of the Western Pacific. The picture you see here in the middle shows Malinowski when he lived with the Trobriand people. In the last slide, this is a depiction of the work of Clifford Geertz, who was another major author of ethnography. He was best known for his frequently cited essay, Deep Play, Notes on the Balinese Cockfight. For this publication, he lived in Bali for a year during the 1950s, attended the illegal cockfights that were popular there at that time, and interviewed people involved in the fights. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about perspectives. Earlier, Mary helped us to understand that ethnographies originated in the field of anthropology. Today, they are used in many different fields with a focus on human society and culture. It's important to understand that there are different perspectives or fields of thought around how ethnography should be conducted. So let's start with the participant versus analytic view. Of great importance here to ethnographies are the perspectives of the people being studied, which is done by being immersed in the culture and having a pretty lengthy contact time with the participants. However, there are others that focus more on the understanding of the perspectives and the actions of the participants. So this could be much different from how participants view themselves, and therefore cause some tension there. There's also the issue of community living versus locale or institution studying. While some ethnographers are of the belief that any true ethnography involves the researcher living in the community among the individuals they're studying for some period of time, others feel that this isn't all that necessary, which is why there has been the development of studies of individual work sites or institutions within a larger society, not anywhere where one would have to live. There are also differing perspectives relative to macro and micro contexts. For some, having a more holistic focus, or in other words, understanding a situation by locating the issue within a larger, broader context like schools or community or anything on a larger level, is the best way to go. Others, however, feel that an ethnography can be done simply by looking and listening carefully to what is said and done during one specific occasion. Perspectives also differ relative to the approaches of ethnographies when looking at traditional ethnography approaches alongside autoethnographies, critical ethnographies, and feminist ethnographies. Some researchers are opposed to those on the right-hand side for their potential connection to politics or their potential to further the interest or goals of marginalized people. They are more of the belief that ethnography should remain neutral and not be on one side or the other. Lastly, there's the in-person versus virtual debate. As was mentioned earlier, some researchers are of the belief that ethnography should consist of participation and observation in the culture being investigated. However, as of late, there are others that feel that ethnographies can be done just as effectively by virtually studying the patterns of online cultures. I'm sure this will continue to be a hot topic with the current way of the world. When conducting ethnographies, there are some primary data collection procedures. Creswell and Powell summarize the steps in this visual here. Basically, after it is determined that an ethnography would be the best design for studying the research problem, the researcher must locate a group to study and select a cultural theme or some kind of issue within that group to study, to focus on. The researcher must then determine the type of ethnography to use and then begin to collect data by participating in the group, doing observations, interviewing people within the group. That's how they'll get the data. And then after that, interpretations are made from the data analysis and patterns of the group are put together and presented.
Here you can find a hierarchy of moving through the types of data analysis used within ethnographic research. So basically, first of all, the researcher gets the view or an inside view, what we also call EMIC perspective, from the participants. And then the researcher takes an outsider perspective or an EDIC view of really looking at and synthesizing the research. From that, they're able to gather an overall cultural interpretation and look for those themes and patterns that were developed from the many data sources that they collected. And finally, with all of that information, they're able to develop a new understanding of the group or the social setting that they were involved in.
Just as in any qualitative research, Creswell and Poth have developed the data analysis spiral. So when you look at this, basically you move from data collection to your account of your findings as a data analysis process. And so with that, as you look at each of the specifics that would be considered in all types of qualitative research, there are some specific Then you might move through reading through the text and making some margin notes and forming initial codes related to the research and interviews and other focus areas that you participated in that social setting. Then your third step might be to describe the social setting, actors, and events, and draw a picture of the setting of your observations and interviews. Finally, you would move to analyzing the data for themes and patterns. And your final step would be interpreting and making sense of those findings about how the culture works. Now, again, in any qualitative research, you might not necessarily start right here at the top and move through those steps I just mentioned. Depending on your research and the different data that you have, you might start at one of these areas of creating your codes and then moving back up and organizing the data and memoing it. So there is a variety of ways that this data analysis spiral can be used with ethnographic methodology. Strengths and limitations of this methodology. First of all, several of the strengths would be that really it provides you a deep picture of the social setting that you're digging into, looking for those cultural patterns. Also, it provides you an insider and outsider view in the field study format that you're looking at. So a true site-based research. No doubt, because there's a variety of procedures that you're participating in with observations and interviews and listening with your field notes, it does provide quality research. And really the strengths allow you to answer what is going on here and what does it all mean. However, there are some limitations. The terminology of going native does come to mind because you really can become very involved in this type of research and then lose that ability to be objective in the research. There's no doubt that because you have to establish rapport and relationships to really gather that data, and you really have to get to know the gatekeepers and the other key informants. This research does require a prolonged time to collect the true data while you're in the field. And some researchers who might be more accustomed to scientific writing find this difficult because it is that more of that narrative storytelling format using the words. I have two examples of research that has been published that is specific to ethnographic. So one of those focused on music and change in being involved in an inner city housing estate in the UK. And so really it was an innovative and intervention program that was accessible to young people looking to meet their mental health needs. and to reduce their offend rates within the UK neighborhoods that they were living in. So basically, there were 15 young adults, 16 to 22-year-olds, that were involved in this research. And basically, they weren't receiving any services. They did not have any education or further education or training, or basically were unemployed. And so the specifics of the data that was gathered through this is that here you would see is where it's extensive and it is a long process, that the researchers had to spend 2 years really getting in and developing this intervention with the participants. And so I think it also reaches out that you have to build those connections and rapport with your people. And then the field notes, the interviews, the conversations were then analyzed for those themes with the participants. And so not only was it the young adults, but some stakeholders and staff, and then really looked at the perception of this project, where they looked at music and how it could change and co-produce this project. I thought something that was interesting with this as well was that some of the actual youth participants also became research consultants. The second example that I looked at was an Australian research project which partnered or looked at parental perspectives on their own children's school readiness and what that really meant, and really whether those students were ready for preschool in the Australian school system. It was in 2 Australian communities that were definitely highly socioeconomic disadvantaged. So there were 39 parents that participated in those 2 communities, and they had to have at least one preschool age child. The specific details of the ethnographic research was that there was a collection of observations and interviews. And like I had said, this was very extensive in the research that was completed, very much with in-person interviews, not only with the parents, but also the service providers. And how it started off with the 2 researchers is that each one spent 1 week engaged with each site, but then they always were involved for 18 months, being there for 1 week or weekly. And what that meant is that they attended group activities, they were in programs, they were team meetings, and community activities as well. Lots of audio recordings that were transcribed. There were interview field notes with transcription into the computer program of NVivo. And then also there was coding of data, which had a constant comparison technique. And finally, one thing that was emphasized in this research, that it really took all of this data to triangulate it and really develop a picture of change of what school readiness had actually meant. We did include 3 slides that have our research include our references from the research that we did about ethnographics. So you can find these in the presentation as well.